Hello everybody, this is Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're back with another of our 5-minute Histories videos. Last time I got so excited about filming outside that I thought we'd try it again, and today we're at Mount Clare in Carroll Park. And Mount Clare is one of the 2 oldest houses in Baltimore City, along with the Robert Long House in Fells Point. And actually maybe we need to do a history video on that, stay tuned. But 1760s, so not 1860s, but 1760s, before the Revolution. And it was built by a gentleman named Carroll the Barrister. And we got to call him the Barrister because we don't want to confuse him with his distant cousin, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Charles, and let's talk a little bit about Charles first, and then we'll get into this house. Our Charles was born in Annapolis, and then educated actually in London at Eton and Cambridge. So a very much of a British gentleman to start out with. He actually went on to get a law degree in London and passed the bar at the Inns of Court. That's where the barrister comes in. And he eventually moves back to Baltimore and takes over his family's business, his family's plantation, just outside of Annapolis. When his father dies, Charles is aged 32 and instantly becomes one of the wealthiest men in Maryland, in Maryland, in our state. He goes on to take his father's place in the General Assembly, and actually in the years leading up to the Revolutionary War, he chairs the committee that goes on to write Maryland's Constitution. And let me read you, it was called the Declaration and Charter of Rights and Form of Government for the state of Maryland. He chairs that committee. As the chair, he is also the one to announce to the royally appointed governor that he's out and he's got to go back home to London. So he makes this big speech ousting the royal governor. And then I guess times were maybe a little different. After that, the governor agrees to go, and Charles hosts him here at Mount Clare until his ship can depart some days later. So I guess jolly old chaps, were they. But he does play an important role in the Revolutionary War, and then goes on to become one of, when Maryland convenes its first Senate as a state, Charles sits in that Senate for many, many years. He builds this house here, Mount Clare, as a plantation. And in fact, before the 1760s when he builds it, it was his brother John's, and John's called it the Savannah Plantation, I believe was the name. When John dies, Charles gets it and renames it Mount Clare after his grandmother, Clare, but it remains a plantation, and we'll get to that in a second. The house, of course, is fantastic, Georgian-style architecture. When he marries at age 41, he marries the 21-year-old Margaret Tilghman. If you know Tilghman Island, it's that same family, I believe. And the two of them complete this house. They have an orangery on one side, and they got washing rooms on the other wing, a very symmetrical building. And this is the seat. It's got rolling hills down to Ridgely's Cove, if you know Ridgely Delight, the same Ridgely family, on the Middle Branch. So before all the city built up, this was 5 miles out of the city, and they had this enormous working plantation. The plantation included a brickyard. They made their own bricks. The house behind me, Mount Clare, was made from those bricks, as were hundreds, maybe thousands of houses in West Baltimore, as was the shot tower, as was Johns Hopkins, the original medical school building, and as was much of the U.S. Naval Academy. All came from bricks here. There was a rich clay deposit that actually Captain John Smith, if you remember him, sailed through, the first one to sail up through and document it. And he noted the red clay on Federal Hill. So there was a brickyard. There were mills. He had grist mills. His plantation grew crops and he ground them. It helped that he also owned a bakery in Annapolis, so he had a ready market for his flour. And then it also, in addition to the mills and the brickyard, it had an ironworks company on it. In fact, his father founded that, called the Baltimore Company Iron Works. And in the colonial era, it was one of the largest in colonial America. And in fact, when we declared independence, it started making iron to be used for American cannons. I think somewhat understandably, when we declared independence, the British said they were no longer going to supply us cannons anymore. And so the Carroll family helped fill that gap. As a plantation, it also had enslaved people. And in fact, Charles was one of the largest slave owners in the state of Maryland. Here on this property, upwards of 200 enslaved people worked. And it was somewhat unusual in that there were crops and orchards, and enslaved people worked in agriculture jobs as they did in, say, a plantation on the Eastern Shore. But they also worked as skilled laborers in the brick yard or in the mills or at the ironworks facility. And as a plantation that was only about 4 miles outside of Baltimore City, it was very close to a big town that offered multiple routes of escape. And in fact, we know that at least 4 people did escape from this plantation, liberty seekers, and they made their way out. Charles had issued ads in Pennsylvania trying to find 2 of them. And in fact, in the early 2000s, this building was listed on the National Park Service's Trail to Freedom route, so commemorating and celebrating the liberty seekers who came through here. But let me wrap up by just saying how we got from the Carroll era to today. In the Civil War, this was called Camp Carroll, and the Union Army used the mansion as their headquarters. After that, the German community took over parts of this as a schuetzen club, basically a beer drinking area, I guess kind of beer drinking and skeet shooting at the same time. Sounds fun. And then in 1970, the Colonial Dames organization, the Maryland chapter of the National Society of Colonial Dames, took over its stewardship and has been the steward ever since. In 1890, it became part of Baltimore City's park system. So today it is owned by the city, but managed and cared for by the Colonial Dames. And the next time we can get in, I encourage you to go. It has fantastic antique furniture, much from the Carroll family. But this parting thought of any place in Maryland, I will argue this house and this estate, this plantation, can tell a rich story of multiple perspectives of Americans of all different races and levels of society. It is a fantastic place. Even without being able to get in, if you're out and about and want a nice place to walk around, come take a look and think of the Carroll family, but think of also the liberty seekers who use this as a platform to make their own escapes. And with that, I will say thanks, and we'll see you next time.